People are rather surprised when you describe Unitarianism, a religious movement of the late 18th century and early 19th century, and a group of believers today, a faith today that still is around in some numbers. People are rather surprised when you discuss Unitarianism as liberal Puritanism. Is there such a thing as liberal Puritanism, Dr. Litton? Well, in some ways, yes, and I'll try to unfold that for you as we go through this particular slide. Remember that we spoke about the Enlightenment in our last lecture, how some of the basic things that were going on in the Enlightenment were the rise of individualism and the notion of individual rights and social contract things. You can go back through your government classes and recap a lot of this stuff, but essentially that was brought about largely by empiricism as a philosophical school. John Locke and Berkeley and all of these fellows. The notion of progress, especially progress in the human condition as a possibility, we can make the world a better place, and an emphasis on rational inquiry. Okay, well, all of that stuff is in the last lecture, and you can recap on that all you want to. But essentially, what happens in the late 1700s, that's the late 18th century, is that a group of people within the denomination known as Puritanism. Remember those guys, the supposed broad brim hat guys, the villains of the Salem witch trials, all of that good stuff. Everybody always wonders what happened to the Puritans. Where did they go? Why don't we have any Puritans anymore? Well, Puritanism as a religious sect in the 18th century begins to call itself Congregationalism, and it still sort of maintained many of the beliefs and many of the much of the dogma of the earlier era, particularly with respect to Calvinism and the notion of the doctrine of election or predestination, whatever you want to call it. This isn't a course on Puritanism, so we won't get into all of that, but it is important to know that Puritanism, especially in New England, was calling itself Congregationalism in the 18th century. Congregationalism just sounds a lot better than Puritanism, doesn't it? Wonder which marketing PR guy got a hold of that. But it certainly is a lot better than sounding than Puritanism because, again, in the 18th century, people want to sound enlightened. They don't want to sound puritanical. They want to sound as though they're congregational. We congregate. We get together. We're very it's almost a democratic sounding name, isn't it? So it's a kind of a symbol of the times that they changed their name in that respect. But Congregationalism continues to flourish, especially in New England, but the rest of the country is seeing an infusion of all kinds of different religions. Presbyterianism and the Quakers, Catholicism, especially in Maryland, the Episcopalians, particularly in the Old South. But Puritanism is still there, and it's calling itself Congregationalism. But what happens in the Enlightenment is a minority of these Puritan Congregationalists begin to publish and teach and preach along the same sort of lines that together that will soon be known as liberal Christianity, or later Unitarianism. So it's a small faction of what used to be the Puritans, now Congregationalists in the 18th century, who began to think a little bit more liberally, progressively about certain things, if you want to call it, choose the adjective you want to use. Some might say heretically, and certainly some would. But Unitarianism as a product of the Enlightenment, this is a sort of a left-wing group within Puritanism, liberal Puritanism, hence my little title there. And they began preaching certain things like, Christianity really could be a rational religion. We need to teach it and preach it like it's a rational religion. We need to abandon this notion that man is inherently evil, this notion of original sin. See, that's an Enlightenment concept, right? The notion of human progress. Well, the Unitarians will say, it's backwards and it's outdated to think of man as being inherently evil or original sin. Man's not inherently evil. Man is inherently good. We're capable of great goodness. Jesus, according to the Unitarians, is not part of the Godhead. There is no Trinity, hence Unitarianism. Jesus is basically a great teacher, an exceptional person. No man has ever been like him before or since. He may have been divinely commissioned by God for his teachings, but he's not God himself. And what Jesus was basically saying, according to Unitarians, is that he is God in the sense that he is one with God sort of spiritually, but not that he is a part of the Godhead. The Unitarians would preach that the Bible contains truth and divine revelation, but it is not inerrant. It contains truth, but not everything in it is divine. Not everything in it is a direct revelation of God. There may be some corruptions and things in the Bible, and we'll get into that in a moment. They also taught that God is benevolent and a force toward continual progress of man and society, and that Christianity is a rational religion, or at least can be defended as a rational religion. So you can see the very, very, very heavy influence of the Enlightenment on this sect within what was old mainstream Puritanism, now Congregationalism. These guys were a minority. They were by no means representative of huge numbers of people, but they did find quite a few adherents among upper middle class, highly educated, more liberal politically, one might say radical, Bostonians and New Englanders. They are a small sect within Puritanism, but they are so influential that a number of these guys who began to preach what they called liberal Christianity, later it would be given a name, Unitarianism, later it would become a denomination, Unitarianism, began to gather some popularity, began to sort of take over, if you will, some of the Congregationalist churches, and you would go through a town like Boston and say, there's a Congregationalist church that's conservative or traditional, or what some would say Calvinist, and there's one over there that has gone Unitarian, as some would say. It's liberal Christianity. It's the liberals versus the conservatives within the Puritanism movement. By 1805, the real watershed event here is that Henry Ware Sr., a Unitarian, a liberal Congregationalist Puritan, is selected as the Hollis Professor of Divinity at Harvard's Divinity School. Now, Harvard was the great school that the Puritans founded back in 1636 when they first came over. It is the oldest university in North America, and of course it was a bastion of Puritanism, and specifically conservative Puritanism. But in 1805, a liberal Christian is hired for that professorship. And really, when we say professorship, we kind of mean sort of the dean of the school, the president of the school. So it went Unitarian. The very bastion of Puritanism for over almost 200 years, which had been in the hands of conservative Puritans for almost 200 years, suddenly is now, the school is now being run by a Unitarian. This freaked conservative Congregationalists out. Traditional old school Puritans were just totally freaked out about it. They began to go to other schools, places like Princeton and Yale and other schools, rather than Harvard, and then Harvard becomes known as a bastion of liberal theology, liberal religion, liberal spirituality, and to this day it is considered quite a bastion of very liberal religious teaching. It no longer adheres to a notion of theological school as being a Christian a divinity school. It is a school of religions, plural. Well, in 1815, Jedediah Morse, a conservative Puritan Congregationalist, publishes American Christianity, which is a work that attacks these left-wing guys and says they're basically not Christian. They're basically not part of us anymore. They're not Puritans. They're not Congregationalists. They're not Orthodox Christians. We'll talk about that in the next slide as to why he would think so. And as a response, in 1819, William Ellery Channing publishes Unitarian Christianity that defends Unitarianism. Remember William Ellery Channing, our likeness to God fellow from the last lecture? He becomes the great face of liberal Christianity / Unitarianism. He becomes the great driving, speaking, intellectual force behind this new denomination, which will eventually split off from Congregationalism. Congregationalists will say, you're not part of us anymore, we will not fellowship with you, and we'll see that in the next slide.